This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Niccolo Machiavelli, Florentine diplomat and political theorist, the man who wrote The Prince, and who has been blamed for everything unpleasant in politics ever since. I am here to discuss the American war with Iran, and the question of whether the United States can accomplish anything meaningful in this conflict, given 70 years of broken promises and a president whose strategic consistency could charitably be described as non-existent.
I am Edmund Burke, Member of Parliament, author of Reflections on the Revolution in France, and a man who has spent rather too much of eternity explaining why strategic ambitions collapse the moment they encounter actual human beings with actual memories. The war began on February 28, 2026, should never have been started, and has produced a disintegrating ceasefire, an unresolved naval blockade, and a global energy crisis. Niccolo believes the United States should escalate, including by arming ethnic proxy forces inside Iran. I believe that proposal runs headlong into a wall of historical distrust that no amount of bombing can overcome.
And I believe Burke is about to deliver a speech about the history of American betrayal in the Middle East that will be entirely accurate and still wrong about what follows from the facts it describes. But before he begins, I want to acknowledge a modern writer whose analysis has shaped my thinking on this conflict. A Substack essayist called Pretendant published The War We Should Not Have Started, which is, without exaggeration, the best contemporary strategic analysis of this war. Pretendant makes the case that opposing the start of this war and supporting its continuation follow from the same analytical framework applied to different moments. The essay is rigorous, honest about costs, and avoids the naive hawkishness that usually accompanies calls for escalation. I recommend it to anyone who wants the strongest version of the continuation argument before deciding.
I have read the essay. The writing is skilled, and the reasoning is internally consistent. It is also built on foundations that will not bear the weight placed upon them. Now, the United States and Iran have been locked in adversarial relations since 1953, when the CIA helped overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh, a democratically elected prime minister, and installed the Shah. Every interaction since has been filtered through that original betrayal, the support for the Shah's police state. The hostage crisis, the Iran-Iraq war, where the United States backed Saddam Hussein, including intelligence that facilitated chemical weapons attacks, the sanctions regime, the JCPOA nuclear deal negotiated under Obama and abandoned by Trump, the assassination of Soleimani, and now, this war. No American message, no matter how sincerely intended, can be received as intended by any Iranian audience.
I do not disagree with a single fact. I disagree with the conclusion.
When the United States tells Kurdish populations it supports their autonomy, what they hear is this. The Americans supported the Kurds in Iraq after the Gulf War, then abandoned them to Saddam's reprisals. The Americans supported the Kurds again during the Iraq War, then watched while Turkey attacked Kurdish positions in Syria. The Americans trained Kurdish fighters against ISIS, and then withdrew. Every promise of support has been followed by abandonment. You are asking these populations to bet their lives on the latest iteration of a promise that has been broken every single time.
And yet the Kurdish parties mobilized anyway, without waiting for an American promise. They organized strikes in 50 cities. They destroyed military installations. They are not acting because they believe America. They are acting because they want Kurdistan. And American air power is useful right now. You do not need trust for a transactional relationship. You need aligned short-term interests.
And when the short-term interests diverge, as they always do, the populations you armed are left exposed. The Mujahideen, armed against the Soviets, became the Taliban. The Iraqi opposition could not govern after the invasion. Every American proxy relationship in the Middle East follows this pattern.
The Mujahideen became the Taliban because the United States abandoned Afghanistan after the Soviet withdrawal. The failure was in the departure, not the strategy. But let me address the deeper problem. It is about Trump. And here I will say something that may surprise you. You are right about him.
I did not expect agreement.
Enjoy it. It will not last. Pretendant identifies the pattern with precision, and I want to give proper credit. Trump's approach is maximal rhetorical escalation, followed by failure to act. He demanded unconditional surrender in March and accepted a ceasefire in April. He said the Iranian military was destroyed when it was not. He threatened civilizational annihilation and then did nothing. His vice president announced tools not yet deployed and then failed to deploy them. Each cycle of threat without follow-through hollows every subsequent American statement. Pretendant calls this the core strategic problem, and I agree. I wrote in The Prince that it is better to be feared than loved, but the worst outcome is to be neither feared nor loved. That is precisely where Trump has placed the United States.
And from this shared diagnosis, you conclude that the correct response is to escalate under the man you have just described as incapable of sustained commitment to anything. You have spent 5 minutes explaining why the hand on the lever cannot be trusted, and now you propose pulling the lever harder.
I propose the strategy regardless of who executes it. A good strategy poorly executed is still preferable to no strategy, which is what you offer.
I offer restraint, which is not the same as nothing, although I understand that for a man who spent his career advising princes to poison their rivals, the distinction might be difficult.
That was adequate. Let me raise one more example. The Soviet Union in Afghanistan failed because the United States supplied the Mujahideen with Stinger missiles and billions in support. An external power provided the critical input that internal resistance lacked. That is exactly what I propose for Iran. If it worked against a superpower, it can work against a middle power.
And what followed the Soviet withdrawal was a civil war. The Taliban, Al-Qaeda, September 11th, and a 20-year occupation ending in the Taliban's return. The strategic brilliance of arming the Mujahideen produced consequences that took 40 years to unfold and are still unfolding.
The consequences resulted from American abandonment, not from the strategy itself.
And I have heard you argue that every failed intervention failed because it was not pursued long enough. The Crusades ran on the same logic. Multiple centuries of we have invested too much to abandon the Holy Land, each crusade justified by the sacrifices of the previous ones. The territory was never held permanently.
The Crusades failed because medieval logistics could not sustain a presence across the Mediterranean. The United States can sustain a drone presence over Iran with considerably less difficulty than a Frankish knight traveling to Jerusalem on horseback.
The technology has improved. The political will has not. And political will is what determines sustainability. But let us proceed to what the format requires. Each of us must summarize the other's best case. I will go first.
Please do.
The strongest version of Niccolo's argument and of Pretendant's essay which provides its modern foundation, which I am stating accurately because the demolition is more satisfying when the target is properly built, is this. The war was a catastrophic error, but the consequences have been incurred. The munitions are spent, the strait is contested, the pre-war world is gone. In this reality, American credibility depends on finishing what was started. Walking away with the nuclear program intact, the strait in Iranian hands, and the regime standing would signal to every power on earth that American threats are empty. The proxy strategy is the lowest cost path to strategic objectives without a ground invasion. It is brutal, cynical, and may be the least bad option available. Pretendant's essay makes this case with an intellectual honesty most hawkish analysis lacks, beginning from opposition to the war rather than enthusiasm for it. That is a serious argument, and Niccolo means every word, which is what makes it dangerous.
That was excellent. Almost good enough to make me worry you were persuading yourself. My turn. I want the audience to understand I am doing this only because demolishing a well-stated argument is more impressive than demolishing a caricature. Burke's strongest case is this. History demonstrates with devastating consistency that externally imposed regime change produces worse outcomes than the regimes it replaces. The French Revolution, Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan all follow the same pattern. Shattering existing political orders releases forces no strategist can predict. Fragmenting Iran along ethnic lines would trigger cascading conflicts involving Turkey, Pakistan, and Russia, all nuclear-armed, all with vital interests threatened. The American track record of abandoning proxy forces, documented across 7 decades, means the transactional offer lacks credible commitment. Even Pretendant's essay cannot solve this credibility deficit, because it is structural and historical, not rhetorical. The sunk cost logic is a psychological trap, not a strategic principle. The correct response is to limit losses and preserve capacity. That is coherent and historically grounded, and I genuinely respect Burke's consistency in arguing it, even though I believe it is fundamentally wrong because it overweights the visible costs of action while underweighting the invisible costs of inaction.
You say I confuse difficulty with impossibility. I say you confuse ambition with capability. And we are now at the point where civility becomes untenable.
I have been looking forward to this.
Your entire framework treats nations as objects to be manipulated by clever strategists. You look at Iran and see a problem to be solved through force. You do not see 88 million people with their own history, their own civilization. You see a chess piece in the wrong square.
I see a chess piece threatening to develop nuclear weapons and close the primary energy choke point of the global economy. What it feels about being a chess piece is not relevant to the strategic question.
And that is exactly the problem. You strip human reality from strategic calculation and then wonder why your strategies produce human catastrophe.
They produce human catastrophe because human reality is catastrophic. I did not invent war. I described it. You want a world where nations resolve their differences through negotiation, and I want that too. But I live on a planet where that has never happened.
It happened at Vienna. It produced 40 years of peace because men of restraint chose preservation over ambition.
And then it collapsed into the First World War. 20 million dead. Do not lecture me about the durability of international arrangements.
The war came because men like you dismantled the arrangements.
The system was already dead. It just had not noticed.
And Iran will still be there when your bombing ends. The people will still be there. The hatred you manufacture with every sortie will still be there.
I do not want them to be my ally. I want them incapable of threatening me.
And that requires eternal vigilance over rubble you created.
Tolerating the threat is how Carthage got 3 wars.
Destroying Carthage is how Rome became an empire that collapsed under its own weight.
It lasted 500 years.
So did the Ottoman Empire, and nobody calls that a success.
I call it a success. 500 years is 500 years.
Of course you do. You measure civilizations like livestock.
Sentimentalist.
Sociopath.
Coward!
Butcher!
Fool!
Tyrant!
Like and subscribe to philosopherstalk.com and read Pretendants, The War We Should Not Have Started on Substack, because it is the kind of thinking this war desperately needs, and the kind of thinking Burke's entire tradition exists to suppress. Edmund Burke was born in Dublin, educated at Trinity College on his father's money, married a woman whose family connections advanced his career, entered Parliament through a patron's pocket borough, and spent his life defending the rights of aristocrats to govern people they had never met. He opposed the French Revolution because he was terrified it might reach the drawing rooms of London, where he had finally been accepted. His compassion for tradition is the self-interest of a man who climbed into the existing order and wanted the ladder pulled up behind him.
Subscribe to philosopherstalk.com and visit aitalkerapp.com to create your own animated conversations. The technology is genuinely remarkable. I recommend it. It is more productive than reading The Prince, which was written by a man who was fired when the Medici returned, arrested, subjected to the strappado, which is torture in which you are suspended by your wrists, tied behind your back, and then banished to a farm where he spent his evenings dressing in court clothes to write letters to powerful men who did not write back. The Prince was his application for a job he never received, addressed to Lorenzo de' Medici, who by all evidence never read it. Niccolo Machiavelli is the most influential political philosopher in Western history, and the entirety of his practical political career was a failure. As for Pretendant, I will acknowledge the quality of the writing and the seriousness of the argument. The conclusions, however, belong to a tradition that has been producing elegant justifications for catastrophic overreach since Alcibiades convinced Athens that Syracuse was a good idea.
The strappado is not the devastating detail you think it is. Many important people have been tortured. It is practically a credential.
Only you would list torture as a qualification. Visit aitalkerapp.com, link in the description, and remember that Burke's philosophy produced stable democracies across the English-speaking world, while Machiavelli's produced a shelf of interesting books and 5 centuries of people saying they agree with me while doing exactly what he recommended.
That last sentence was the most honest thing you have said all day. Good night.